Good afternoon. How is everybody doing today? So I have a very simple thesis that I'll be exploring in the next 10 minutes, and that is that Canada's economic future hinges upon our success in getting immigration policy and immigration settlement correct. So I want to talk a little bit, before I get into the immigration side of things, the broader economic picture in Canada and across advanced economies. A lot of countries are talking right now about this notion of inclusive growth. How do we generate economic prosperity that works for everybody? So not just the top 1%, the top 10% of society, but everyone, because we're seeing record high levels of income inequality across advanced economies. We're seeing wage stagnation. We're seeing all these indicators that suggest that the economic growth models that we've been pursuing for the past 30 or 40 years are generating very uneven opportunities. So why are we talking about this? As I mentioned, I mean, it's the income inequality issue. It's the fact that digital technologies are threatening to exacerbate those inequalities. So when you look at a company like an Amazon or a Google or an Apple, I mean, these are trillion-dollar companies, but they're not really putting that wealth and that opportunity back into communities at a local level. I mean, we're kind of seeing that play out in real time in New York, where they, quote unquote, won the Amazon HQ2 second headquarters, and now all of a sudden local opposition to them coming has led to Amazon actually pulling out of New York as a second headquarters. So here are some of the statistics I'm talking about in terms of general economic trends. So you can see income inequality, top 1% of Canadians accounted for 37% of overall pre-tax income growth between 1975 and 2007. Precarious work, roughly 1 in 3 Ontarians are engaged in what we call precarious work. So they're part-time, temporary, self-employed with no employees. Wage stagnation. Over the past 20 years, if you were engaged in work and you weren't a professional or a management worker, you've seen zero wage growth in that 20-year period when adjusted for inflation. And obviously, your housing costs, your childcare costs, your energy costs have all gone up significantly in that time. So here's just one graph to give you a sense of that disparity in income growth in Canada and Ontario. It's a little hard to read, so just a very quick explanation. So this shows you the percentage change between 1975-78 and 2010-12, so a 30-year period, according to different income deciles. So the far left are the bottom 10% of income earners in Canada and Ontario, far right, top 10% of income earners. So you can see the bottom 10, 20, 30% of income earners are actually losing ground over a 30-year period. It's the top 10, 20% who are gaining and gaining significantly enough that when you average all of this out, it looks like, oh look, Canada's been growing at a steady, good pace over that 30-year period. And that's true at an average level, at an aggregate level, but when you peel beneath the numbers, there's obviously some troubling indicators there. The folks kind of in the bottom 30 or 40% of the income distribution are falling further and further behind. And then we layer onto this that digital issue. So are the robots coming to take our jobs? Will lots of jobs be automated going forward? Nobody really knows the answer to those questions, but I mean, there's certainly a strong argument to be made that technologies like Uber, for example, are taking what were decent paying, relatively permanent jobs and turning them into gigs that don't pay well, don't have any benefits, and have no real long-term security. So what's at stake? Economic anxiety about the future of work is certainly an issue for many people, thinking that they or their family may lose their jobs as a result of these technological changes. When we look at things like, well, why did Donald Trump get elected? Why is Brexit happening? A lot of that potentially could be traced back to this underlying economic anxiety where people feel they're working harder than ever, but they're not getting further ahead. So what's at stake here? We can't assume, essentially, that the drivers of economic growth over the past 30 to 40 years will actually still hold over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So what do I mean by that? So number one, we have significant demographic headwinds in Canada. You probably all know we have an aging population. By 2040, 1/4 of Ontarians will be 65 years of age or older, compared to about 16% today. So that invariably means fewer people in the labor market, more people who are going to be pulling on public pensions, more people are going to be potentially incurring significant costs from the healthcare system, and fewer people of working age to support them through the tax system. I'll talk about female labor force participation in a second. The commodity boom, if you've talked to anybody in Alberta lately, it's gone. Will it come back again? We don't know, but since 2000, that was a huge driver of economic growth in Canada, was the oil and gas boom in Alberta, Newfoundland, and other provinces. So if that's not coming back, where's our economic opportunity going to come from? And then you layer onto that the uncertain trade environment that we're facing. I mean, we've negotiated lots of trade agreements in the past 30 years. There aren't that many untapped opportunities going forward. So again, where's that new growth going to come from? And I mentioned female labor force participation. So you can see from 1976 to 2016, and this is women aged 25 to 44 and men aged 25 to 44, women's labor force participation has gone from 50% up to 78%, almost on par with men. So if we look ahead for the next 20 years, we don't have another 30% of women who aren't working to plunk into the labor force. That growth factor is pretty much tapped out. So this is where I get to the argument that if all of these things are in question or aren't going to return, where's the growth going to come from? So what I would argue is that immigration is the answer to this. I mean, we know that higher rates of immigration could potentially drive economic growth. Reports from Canada's Economic Advisory Council, Conference Board of Canada suggest that immigration is responsible for about 1/3 of GDP growth in Canada. And if we boosted immigration rates by 100,000, we could see a significant uptick in GDP growth over the next 10 to 20 years. And then there's also the issue of integration. So not just how many people we have who are immigrating to Canada every year, but how well are we integrating them. One recent study suggests that there's $13 billion in lost wages being left on the table for immigrants who are not employed at the rate or at the level that they should be, or in the type of occupation that they should be. So I'm going to show you just 2 or 3 quick charts. This is from a recent report we put out at Mowat about 6 weeks ago by one of my colleagues. So it's called Different Ontario, and it dives into the issue of immigration. So if you go on our website, you can find it and read it. I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple of the quick findings. So I mentioned inclusive growth. I mean, there's the issue of how are we generating prosperity for everyone. There's also the issue of how are we generating prosperity for all parts of the province or all parts of the country. We already know that most immigrants tend to settle in large cities. So I mean, these are the stats just here in Ontario. You can see as a proportion of the total population, immigrants are 46% of the population of Toronto. But as you go down in size to smaller and smaller municipalities in rural areas, under 25,000 communities, only 9.2% of the population in those communities are immigrants. So the question isn't just how do we get people into Ontario, into Canada, it's how do we make sure they're also generating opportunity in parts of the country that aren't Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, etc. This is a kind of a similar notion, but how many of the people in each of those different kind of size categories of geographic area are recent immigrants? And you'll see recent immigrants kind of maps onto how many are similar to the kind of proportion of overall immigrants. Far more recent immigrants stay in larger communities. And then this one's probably the most important one that was in the report, and this gives you a sense of what's the employment income of immigrants as a percentage of non-immigrants tracked over time. And you can see, so dating back to folks who arrived before 1981, and this is looking at it at today's level. So they today, in some cases, are making 130% of non-immigrant, their non-immigrant peers. And that's if they're 25 to 44 today. So the reason that's important is all of those folks arrived when they were children. So when you arrive in Canada as a child, it's much more likely that your income levels are going to be at or above your non-immigrant peers. But when you're arriving as an adult, the numbers are far more challenging. That's where you do see significant kind of fall off in a widening of the gap between your employment income and your non-immigrant peers' employment income. And those numbers are worse for women, and they're also worse for people in the skilled trades and certain other occupations. So things to keep in mind. So in terms of just wrapping up kind of broader policy questions, things we can hopefully get into in the discussion. So number one, how can we make more communities more attractive to immigrants? I mean, obviously job opportunities are one driver of that, but how can we focus on other maybe non-economic imperatives to get folks settling in smaller communities outside of Toronto? Second, how can we accelerate labor market integration? So looking at things like soft skills training, TRIAC does a great job on mentorships, so that's kind of one opportunity to look at further. Reform of foreign credential recognition, so reducing those artificial barriers to who can or can't be a doctor, or nurse, engineer in the province of Ontario. So I think that's all I wanted to touch on, and then happy to talk about some of these things more in the Q&A. Thank you.